Let me begin with a question. What happened to Pan-Africanism? How did a continent that once produced powerful visions of unity, solidarity, and collective liberation arrive at a point where Africans are increasingly suspicious of, hostile toward, or even violent against one another? For much of the 20th century, Pan-Africanism was more than a political idea. It was a movement. It inspired freedom fighters, intellectuals, and ordinary people across the continent and the diaspora. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, and many others believed that Africa's future depended on cooperation rather than division. They understood something profound. Divided, Africa would remain vulnerable. United, Africa could become one of the most powerful forces in the world. Yet today, we are witnessing a troubling trend. In several parts of the continent, Africans are increasingly viewed not as brothers and sisters, but as competitors, outsiders, or even threats. In South Africa, tensions surrounding migration have sparked debates about xenophobia and what some now call Afrophobia, the fear or hostility directed specifically toward fellow Africans. This raises difficult questions. What happened to the dream of African unity? Why has economic frustration become redirected toward fellow Africans? Who benefits when Africans fight Africans? And perhaps most importantly, what can be done to rebuild trust, solidarity, and a shared vision for the future? This presentation is not about blaming any one group. It is about understanding the historical, economic, political, and social forces that have shaped this moment. Because before we can solve a problem, we must first understand it. So as we begin, I invite you to keep one central question in mind. Has Pan-Africanism failed, or have we simply forgotten what it was trying to teach us? This is Griot Wave Academy, African Civilisations Series. Before we continue, it is important to understand the mission behind Griot Wave Academy. This platform was created to preserve knowledge, culture, music, and stories that often go unheard or are forgotten. Griot Wave is not just about content. It is about building independent systems of learning, creativity, and empowerment. Through books, audio, technology, and media, the goal is to transform timeless wisdom into practical tools for today's generation and future generations. The same continent that invented democracy and Kemet, the same soil that produced the greatest liberation thinkers of the 20th century, that very continent is now wrestling with a virus called Afrophobia. Today, we diagnose it, and we chart the cure. At the heart of this presentation lies a question that should trouble every African, whether on the continent or in the diaspora. How did we get here? How did the continent that gave the world visionaries like Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Patrice Lumumba, and Thomas Sankara arrive at a point where Africans sometimes see fellow Africans as enemies rather than allies? These leaders dreamed of something bigger than the borders inherited from colonialism. They imagined a continent united by common destiny, shared prosperity, and mutual responsibility. They believed that Africa's strength would come not from isolation, but from solidarity. Yet today, in many places, we see growing hostility between Africans. We hear accusations. We witness violence. We watch communities turn against one another, while many of the challenges they face, unemployment, inequality, corruption, poor governance, and economic exclusion, remain unresolved. This raises the first question on this slide. How was a continent-wide liberation dream replaced by nativist violence? Was this transformation inevitable? Or did historical forces, political decisions, and economic pressures slowly erode the Pan-African vision over generations? The second question may be even more important. Who benefits when Africans see each other as the enemy? History teaches us that division often serves someone's interests. When people fight one another, they are less likely to challenge the systems that affect them all. When frustration is redirected sideways, attention is diverted away from deeper structural problems. And finally, perhaps the most important question of all, can we rebuild what colonialism and its aftermath damaged? Because this presentation is not simply an exercise in criticism. It is a search for understanding, and ultimately, solutions. As we move forward, I invite you to think critically, challenge assumptions, and examine the evidence. The goal is not to assign blame. The goal is to understand how we moved from a vision of African unity to a reality of African division, and whether a different future is still possible. Everything that follows is an attempt to answer these three questions. Before we begin, let me give you a roadmap for where we are going. This is not just a story about South Africa. It is not just a story about xenophobia or politics. It is the story of a dream born in some of the darkest chapters of African history. A dream that inspired millions with the belief that Africans, despite colonial borders and divisions, shared a common destiny. Today, we will trace the rise, decline, and possible rebirth of that dream through 5 chapters. Chapter 1: The Dream Born in Chains. We begin during slavery, colonialism, and racial oppression. It was in this era of suffering that Pan-Africanism emerged. Africans and people of African descent realized their struggles were connected and began imagining a united future. Chapter 2: The Liberation Decade. The 1950s and 1960s saw colonial empires fall and new nations emerge. Leaders such as Nkrumah, Nyerere, and Lumumba believed independence was only the beginning. Their ultimate goal was a united and self-determined Africa. Chapter 3: The Betrayal. The dream soon faced powerful challenges. Cold War rivalries, coups, debt, corruption, economic dependency, and neo-colonial influence weakened the vision of continental unity. We ask a difficult question: was the dream lost or deliberately undermined? Chapter 4: Modern Nationalism and Afrophobia. This brings us to the present. How did solidarity become scapegoating? Why are fellow Africans increasingly seen as competitors or threats? Why are migrants often blamed for problems rooted in deeper political and economic failures? Chapter 5: Reclaiming the Dream. Finally, we look forward. New generations, new institutions, and initiatives, such as the African Continental Free Trade Area, offer fresh possibilities for cooperation and integration. Perhaps the Pan-African dream is not ending, but entering a new chapter. By the end of this journey, our goal is not simply to understand what went wrong. It is to explore whether Africa can recover the vision that once inspired an entire continent, and what role each of us can play in shaping its future. To understand where the dream went, we must first understand where it came from. Let us begin at the beginning. The dream born in chains. To understand how we lost the dream, we must first understand the dream itself. Every great movement begins with a dream, but some dreams are born not in comfort, not in prosperity, and not in freedom. Some dreams are born in chains. The idea of Pan-Africanism did not emerge from palaces, government offices, or universities alone. It emerged from centuries of struggle, from the slave ships crossing the Atlantic, from the plantations of the Americas, from the colonial occupations of Africa, and from the daily humiliation of people told they were inferior because of the color of their skin. For millions of Africans and people of African descent, a painful realization slowly emerged. Although they were separated by oceans, languages, and colonial borders, they were facing many of the same systems of oppression. And from that realization came a revolutionary idea. What if Africans everywhere saw themselves as one people? What if the fate of a worker in Ghana was connected to the fate of a student in South Africa, a farmer in Kenya, or a descendant of enslaved Africans in Jamaica, Brazil, Britain, or the United States? This idea became known as Pan-Africanism. It was more than a political philosophy. It was a declaration that Africans shared a common history, a common struggle, and a common future. Long before African countries became independent, Pan-African thinkers were already imagining a united Africa. Figures such as Henry Sylvester Williams, W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, George Padmore, and later Kwame Nkrumah helped transform Pan-Africanism from an idea into a movement. They challenged colonialism, they challenged racism, and perhaps most importantly, they challenged the notion that Africans should remain divided. The clenched fist you see on this slide symbolizes resistance, dignity, and collective strength. It reminds us that the dream of African unity was forged in adversity. It was born when people who had every reason to lose hope chose instead to imagine freedom. And before we can understand why that dream appears weakened today, we must first appreciate how powerful it once was. Because the story of Pan-Africanism is not merely the story of politics. It is the story of a people determined to reclaim their humanity and their destiny. So who were the men and women who first carried this dream? Let us meet the architects of Pan-Africanism and explore how an idea born in chains became a movement that inspired an entire continent. One of the greatest misconceptions about Pan-Africanism is that it began in Africa. In reality, it was largely born in the African diaspora, among people separated from the continent by slavery, colonialism, and displacement. Long before most African nations gained independence, Black intellectuals and activists were asking a powerful question. What if Africans everywhere shared a common destiny? In 1893, Reverend Alexander Crummell founded the American Negro Academy, one of the first institutions dedicated to advancing Black intellectual thought and challenging racist ideas about African people. In 1900, Henry Sylvester Williams organized the first Pan-African Conference in London. For the first time, the term Pan-African entered political discourse. A new vision emerged, one people connected by history, struggle, and destiny. The movement gained momentum through W.E.B. Du Bois, who helped organize 5 Pan-African Congresses between 1919 and 1945. These gatherings challenged colonial rule, demanded equality, and insisted that Africans had the right to govern themselves. A Du Bois quote worth remembering is, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." He understood that Africa's liberation was inseparable from Black liberation, everywhere. A pivotal moment came in 1944, when future leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah, George Padmore, and Jomo Kenyatta met in London. The dream of African unity was moving from theory to action. Then, in 1945, The Manchester Pan-African Congress transformed the movement. No longer asking for reform, delegates demanded freedom, self-government, independence, and dignity. The message was clear. Africa must belong to Africans. What is remarkable is that many who first imagined a united Africa lived outside the continent itself. Yet they saw its potential with extraordinary clarity. The roots of Pan-Africanism remind us that African unity was never an accident. It was a deliberate vision, built by people who believed that the liberation of one African was connected to the liberation of all Africans. And that leaves us with an important question. If our ancestors could imagine a united Africa while living under colonialism, slavery, and segregation, why do we struggle to imagine it today? Next, let us meet the individuals who transformed Pan-Africanism from an idea into one of history's most influential liberation movements. Every great movement has its thinkers, dreamers, and builders. Pan-Africanism was not created by one person. It was forged by visionaries across Africa and the diaspora who believed that the destiny of African people was interconnected. Consider their sacrifices. Kwame Nkrumah was jailed by the British before leading Ghana to independence in 1957. W.E.B. Du Bois spent decades organizing Pan-African congresses and died in Ghana in 1963. Patrice Lumumba was assassinated just 67 days after becoming Congo's first prime minister. Cheikh Anta Diop faced repeated academic rejection because his research challenged accepted narratives about Africa's place in world civilization. These were not merely dreamers. They were architects of a new Africa. Nkrumah warned that Africa faced a choice: unite or become vulnerable to external control and internal division. His famous declaration, "Africa must unite or perish," remains one of the most important warnings in African political history. Du Bois envisioned Africa's global significance long before independence swept the continent. Nyerere believed true freedom required cooperation among African nations, not simply the lowering of colonial flags. Lumumba saw African liberation as a shared continental project. Garvey inspired millions to reclaim their dignity, history, and confidence, while Diop argued that mental liberation must come before political liberation. What makes these figures remarkable is that they came from different countries, spoke different languages, and lived under different circumstances. Yet they shared one conviction: Africa's future could not be built on fragmentation. They believed that colonial borders should never be stronger than the bonds of shared history, shared struggle, and shared destiny. That is why our present moment raises an uncomfortable question. Many of these leaders dedicated their lives to convincing Africans that they belong together. What would they think if they witnessed Africans attacking fellow Africans because they came from a different country? Would they recognize the continent they dreamed of? Or would they see a dream still unfinished? The ideas of these pioneers would soon leave conference halls and books and enter the streets, parliaments, and liberation movements of Africa. The dream was about to become reality as the continent entered its great liberation decade. One of the biggest misunderstandings about Pan-Africanism is that it was simply an emotional appeal for Africans to love one another. It was not. Pan-Africanism was a political, economic, cultural, and security project, a blueprint for survival in a world dominated by powerful states and competing interests. Its leaders understood that independence would mean little if Africa remained divided, economically dependent, and disconnected from itself. Pan-Africanism was concrete. Nkrumah's "Africa Must Unite" 1963 was not a slogan but a policy vision proposing a continental parliament, central bank, common currency, and joint defense system. Why are supranational institutions celebrated in Europe, yet Africa is often told it is not ready for deeper integration? The vision rested on 4 pillars. Political unity. Leaders like Nkrumah believed Africa's colonial borders had left the continent fragmented and vulnerable. Their dream was a federated Africa capable of speaking with one voice, coordinating development, and defending its interests. Imagine Africa negotiating globally as one bloc rather than dozens of separate states. Economic sovereignty. The founders recognized that political independence without economic control is incomplete freedom. For centuries, African resources enriched distant powers, while local populations remained poor. Their goal was simple: African wealth should primarily benefit African people. Cultural renaissance. The struggle was also psychological. Colonial systems often taught Africans to reject their own histories, languages, and philosophies. Pan-African thinkers argued that people disconnected from their identity are easier to divide and control. Reclaiming confidence, memory, and dignity was essential. Collective defense. History showed that African societies were often conquered one by one. The founders envisioned continental security through cooperation, ensuring no nation would stand alone against external pressure or destabilization. Notice that every pillar depends on unity. Political unity, economic cooperation, shared identity, collective security. So what happens when Africans begin to see one another as rivals, rather than partners? What happens when solidarity becomes suspicion and the dream begins to crack? To answer that, we move to the next chapter of our story. The year is the 1950s. Across Africa, empires are beginning to tremble. The liberation decade has arrived. If Chapter 1 was about the dream, Chapter 2 is about the moment that dream seemed within reach. For decades, Pan-Africanists had spoken of liberation, self-determination, and African unity. Many dismissed these ideas as unrealistic. Colonial empires appeared too powerful. The dream seemed too ambitious. Then history changed. Beginning in the 1950s, a political earthquake swept across Africa. Colonial flags came down. Independent African nations began to rise. What had once been a continent dominated by foreign empires was becoming a continent of self-governing states. From the 1950s through the 1970s, Africa experienced one of the most transformative periods in its history, a time of extraordinary hope. A generation emerged that believed Africa was not simply becoming free, it was preparing to shape its own future. Across the continent, liberation movements gained momentum. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah led the first sub-Saharan African colony to independence in 1957. In Congo, Patrice Lumumba demanded genuine sovereignty. In Tanzania, Julius Nyerere championed a vision rooted in African values and cooperation. Across Algeria, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and elsewhere, people fought, sacrificed, and died for the right to govern themselves. The energy of the era was contagious. Political independence was seen not as the destination, but as the beginning. The larger goal remained unchanged: a united, prosperous, and self-confident Africa. For the first time in centuries, Africans were beginning to shape their destiny on a continental scale. Yet the liberation leaders understood something important. Raising a flag and singing a national anthem would not automatically create freedom. The real challenge was what came next. Could newly independent states work together? Could they resist external pressure? Could they build economies that served their people? Could they preserve the spirit of Pan-African solidarity after independence? These questions would define the next chapter of Africa's story. The dream was alive. The flags were rising. The crowds were celebrating. But beneath the optimism, powerful forces were already gathering. Forces that would test the unity, independence, and vision of the new Africa. To understand the height of the Pan-African dream, let us now explore the remarkable wave of independence and the leaders who believed a new Africa was being born. If there was ever a moment when the Pan-African dream seemed unstoppable, it was between 1957 and 1975. In less than 2 decades, more than 40 African nations achieved independence, transforming the political map of the continent. What had seemed impossible for centuries suddenly became reality. The turning point came in 1957, when Ghana gained independence under Kwame Nkrumah. But Nkrumah saw Ghana's freedom as only the beginning. He declared, "Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of Africa." His vision was never national, it was continental. Momentum accelerated in 1960, the year of Africa, when 17 African countries gained independence in a single year. The wave of liberation was so powerful that colonial powers recognized the old order was collapsing. Africa was changing, and there was no turning back. In 1963, African leaders gathered in Addis Ababa to establish the Organization of African Unity, OAU. For the first time, Pan-Africanism became more than an idea. It had institutions, a charter, and a continental platform. Yet challenges soon emerged. The Nigerian Civil War, 1967 to 1970, exposed a difficult reality. Could states created by colonial borders remain united after independence? The conflict revealed the fragility beneath the optimism. Despite these setbacks, liberation continued. By 1975, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, and others had achieved independence. Across Africa, there was a growing belief that the continent's future was finally in African hands. It was a time of enormous hope. Colonial flags came down. African leaders took office. New constitutions, universities, industries, and institutions were built. For millions, the future looked brighter than it had in generations. But beneath the celebration lay a challenge few fully appreciated. Winning independence was one battle, preserving it would be another. While colonial rule was ending, the struggle for economic sovereignty, political stability, and continental unity was only beginning. The dream had survived slavery, colonialism, and occupation. It had inspired liberation across an entire continent. But if the dream was winning, what happened next? One of the most important truths about African independence is this: freedom was not given, it was fought for. When we look at Africa today, it is easy to forget that most African nations were once controlled by foreign powers. Independence did not arrive because colonial governments changed their minds. Across the continent, millions organized, protested, resisted, and, in many cases, took up arms to reclaim their sovereignty. These were Africa's frontline fighters. From Algeria's FLN resisting French rule, to Kenya's Mau Mau uprising under leaders like Dedan Kimathi, to Zimbabwe's Chimurenga struggle against white minority Rhodesia, liberation movements challenged some of the most powerful colonial systems on earth. In Mozambique, Frelimo and Samora Machel defeated Portuguese colonialism, while in South Africa, the ANC, PAC, and countless activists fought apartheid through decades of sacrifice, imprisonment, protest, and armed resistance. Then there was Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau, one of Africa's greatest revolutionary thinkers. Cabral argued that liberation was not only about removing colonial rulers, but reclaiming culture, dignity, and consciousness. His ideas influenced movements across Africa and beyond. A striking pattern emerges from this era. Many of Africa's most visionary leaders, Lumumba, Nkrumah, Cabral, Machel, and Sankara, were assassinated, imprisoned, or overthrown, often amid external interference. This raises an important question. Who benefited when Pan-African leaders were removed? Despite different languages, borders, and colonial rulers, liberation movements increasingly saw themselves as part of one continental struggle. Freedom fighters trained together. Governments supported one another. Ideas crossed borders. Pan-Africanism was no longer just a theory. It was becoming a lived reality. And that is what makes today's tensions so striking. The generation that fought for liberation sought to break down barriers between Africans. Yet today, we sometimes see new barriers being erected, not by colonial powers, but by Africans themselves. What happened to the solidarity that once united liberation movements across the continent? To answer that question, we must first understand how close Africa came to realizing the Pan-African dream during the independence era. As liberation victories spread across Africa, many believed the continent was entering a golden age of unity. The dream had never seemed closer. If there is one slide that captures the ambition of Pan-Africanism, it is this one. Kwame Nkrumah was not simply Ghana's first president. He saw himself as part of a continental project. He believed political independence would mean little if Africa remained divided into dozens of small states, while larger powers dominated the global economy. In Africa Must Unite, 1963, Nkrumah argued that Africa's future depended on unity. His vision was not abstract idealism, but a political blueprint. Ironically, many of the institutions he proposed for Africa, a parliament, central bank, free movement, common market, and supranational governance, were later adopted by Europe through the European Union. His dream rested on 6 pillars: a continental parliament to give Africa one voice on trade, security, technology, migration, and global affairs; an African central bank to ensure financial sovereignty and reduce dependence on external institutions; a unified currency to strengthen economic integration and facilitate trade; a continental army to provide collective security against destabilization and foreign interference; free movement so Africans could work, study, build businesses, and settle anywhere on the continent as fellow Africans, rather than foreigners; a common market that prioritized intra-African trade and transformed Africa into an economic powerhouse. Nkrumah believed Africa could become one of the world's greatest forces for good, not through domination, but through cooperation, trust, and shared prosperity. The uncomfortable question is this. Compare that blueprint with today's reality. Continental unity versus fragmentation. Free movement versus hostility toward migrants. Pan-Africanism versus Afrophobia. The dream had a blueprint. The dream had leaders. The dream had momentum. So why was it stopped? How did Africa move from a vision of shared prosperity and continental citizenship to a reality where some Africans fear, resent, or attack fellow Africans? To answer that question, we must turn to one of the most difficult chapters in the story of Pan-Africanism, Chapter 3, The Betrayal. What happened between 1963 and today was not simply a series of accidents. It was the result of powerful forces, both external and internal, that weakened the dream of African unity. To understand today's divisions, we must understand the tools that fragmented the continent. By the mid-1970s, Africa appeared unstoppable. Colonial empires were retreating, liberation movements were succeeding, dozens of nations had gained independence, and the Organization of African Unity promised a new future. Yet political independence did not automatically bring economic independence. The flags changed, the presidents changed, but many structures of power remained. Kwame Nkrumah warned of this long before it happened. He called it neo-colonialism, a system where a nation appears independent but remains economically, financially, or strategically dependent on external powers. The colonial governor leaves, but influence stays. The chains become less visible. During the Cold War, Africa became a battleground for global competition. Foreign powers fought for influence, resources, and strategic advantage. Leaders who pursued genuine sovereignty often faced isolation, overthrow, or assassination. At the same time, Africa faced challenges from within. Newly independent states had to choose between continental unity and national interests, shared sovereignty and political control. State building, ethnic tensions, border disputes, and economic pressures gradually pushed many countries inward. The result was fragmentation. The united front of the liberation era weakened. Continental institutions remained fragile, regional cooperation struggled, and much of Africa's wealth continued flowing outward through debt, unequal trade, and resource extraction. The greatest danger was not simply foreign interference. It was forgetting the original vision. When unity weakens, division fills the vacuum. Nationalism, rivalry, suspicion, and eventually hostility between Africans themselves. This chapter is not about blaming outsiders for everything, or denying African responsibility. It is about understanding how external pressures and internal weaknesses combined to pull Africa away from the bold vision of its founders. So we must ask a difficult question. Was the dream defeated from the outside, or abandoned from within? The answer may be both. To understand how the dream fragmented, we must now examine the forces that reshaped African politics, economics, and identity after independence. If Chapter 2 was the story of liberation, this chapter asks a harder question. Did the struggle truly end when colonial flags came down? Kwame Nkrumah called the answer neo-colonialism. In 1965, he argued that many African states were politically independent but economically controlled from outside. They had flags, presidents, and seats at the United Nations, but key economic decisions were often shaped elsewhere. His warning alarmed powerful interests. After publishing Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism in 1965, the U.S. State Department lodged a formal protest. Less than a year later, Nkrumah was overthrown in a CIA-backed coup while on a peace mission to Vietnam. Many Pan-Africanists point to several mechanisms of neo-colonial influence. Structural adjustment programs imposed during the debt crises of the 1980s and 1990s required privatization, spending cuts, and austerity. Supporters said they stabilized economies. Critics argue they weakened education, healthcare, and industrial development. The CFA franc system remains controversial today. 14 African countries still use a currency historically tied to France. Critics argue it limits monetary sovereignty. Senegalese economist and activist Ndongo Samba Sylla has described the arrangement as a form of financial dependence. Military coups repeatedly disrupted post-independence development, removing governments and weakening long-term continental cooperation. Debt dependency remains another concern. Africa is often described as a net exporter of wealth, with billions flowing outward annually through debt repayments, profit repatriation, and capital flight. The deeper issue is not any single policy. It is whether political independence is complete without economic sovereignty. Nkrumah believed Africa could not be truly free until it controlled its own resources, financial systems, and development priorities. And if economic frustrations continue to grow, where does public anger go? Does it challenge the structures behind those frustrations, or is it redirected toward fellow Africans? That question becomes crucial when examining migration tensions, xenophobia, and Afrophobia across the continent. History remembers great movements. Less often do we ask what happened to the people who carried them forward. This slide explores one of modern Africa's most painful patterns: the assassination, overthrow, imprisonment, or marginalization of leaders who championed sovereignty, unity, and self-determination. Consider Thomas Sankara. In less than 4 years, he vaccinated 2.5 million children, planted 10 million trees, built hundreds of schools, promoted women into leadership, and rejected IMF dependency. In 1987, he was killed during a coup led by his former ally Blaise Compaoré. His story raises a difficult question. If leaders who seek to unite and transform Africa are repeatedly removed, who benefits from Africa's division? Each case is unique, and historians continue to debate aspects of these events. Yet a broader pattern emerges. Patrice Lumumba envisioned a sovereign Congo controlling its own resources. Within months of independence, he was overthrown and murdered. Sylvanus Olympio sought greater economic independence for Togo. He was assassinated in one of Africa's first post-independence coups. Amilcar Cabral, one of Africa's greatest political thinkers, was killed months before Guinea-Bissau achieved independence. Chris Hani, a leading figure in South Africa's liberation struggle, was assassinated during the country's democratic transition. What united these figures was not simply their deaths, but what they represented: sovereignty, self-reliance, Pan-African cooperation, and the courage to challenge entrenched power. Imagine if Lumumba had governed Congo for decades, if Cabral had built Guinea-Bissau, or if Sankara had completed his reforms. We cannot know what history would have become, but we can recognize the cost of losing visionaries. This is not about hero worship or conspiracy theories. It is about asking what happens to a movement when many of its boldest leaders are removed. The dream did not disappear overnight. It weakened gradually through fragmentation, dependency, leadership crises, and competing national interests. To understand today's divisions, we must understand how unity slowly gave way to separation. Few institutions in African history carried more symbolism than the Organization of African Unity, OAU. When African leaders gathered in Addis Ababa in 1963, they hoped to transform a continent emerging from colonialism into a force for liberation, cooperation, and unity. The OAU promised to coordinate development, support liberation movements, defend sovereignty, and promote solidarity among African states. It achieved important successes, supporting liberation struggles in southern Africa, helping isolate apartheid South Africa, and providing a platform for African leaders to cooperate and resolve disputes. Yet history requires honesty. The OAU never became the Continental Union envisioned by Kwame Nkrumah and other Pan-Africanists. One major obstacle was the principle of non-interference. Designed to protect newly independent states from external domination, it often prevented action against dictatorships, human rights abuses, and governance failures. The shield that protected sovereignty sometimes protected oppression. Nkrumah's proposal for a continental government, common institutions, and collective defense was rejected. Most leaders feared losing sovereignty and chose cooperation between states rather than political union. As a result, the OAU became a coordinating body rather than a true federation. The Cold War further divided the continent. Some governments aligned with Western powers, others with the Soviet bloc, allowing external rivalries to shape African politics. At the same time, the decision to preserve colonial borders prevented wider conflict, but locked Africa into political structures created by colonial powers. Financial limitations also weakened the organization. Without sufficient independent funding, the OAU lacked the resources to fully implement its ambitions. This is the great irony. The OAU helped Africa become politically independent, but struggled to make Africa politically united. It defended sovereignty but often at the expense of integration. As the dream of continental unity weakened, Africans increasingly thought as separate national groups rather than as one people. The question is not whether the Pan-African dream existed, but whether Africa chose caution over unity, and what that choice ultimately cost. As continental unity weakened, a new force emerged: nationalism without Pan-Africanism. To understand today's tensions, we must examine how solidarity gradually gave way to suspicion, competition, and division. If you are serious about Africa's future, you must also become serious about personal growth, execution, discipline, entrepreneurship, and building. Knowledge without implementation changes nothing. That is exactly why I'm building the Griot Wave Inner Circle, an execution-focused community for builders, creators, entrepreneurs, and purpose-driven individuals. A space focused on accountability, implementation, entrepreneurship, transformation, AI and digital leverage, community, and real progress. Weekly live sessions, execution systems, focused builders, real conversations, real growth. If you are tired of consuming endlessly and ready to start building intentionally, scan the QR code or use the link below to join the early interest list. Stop consuming, start building. Don't build alone. Join the Griot Wave Inner Circle and connect with a community focused on real execution and transformation. Scan the QR code to begin. We now arrive at the chapter that brings us directly to the present day. This chapter asks difficult questions about identity, belonging, fear, and division. Most importantly, it asks what happened to the spirit of African solidarity that once united a continent. National pride is not the problem. Every people have the right to celebrate their culture and protect their interests. The problem begins when pride becomes hostility, identity becomes exclusion, and fellow Africans become targets for deeper frustrations. Everything we have explored so far, the assassinated leaders, broken institutions, debt systems, structural adjustment programs, and neo-colonial structures, is not merely history. It is the context for tensions unfolding on African streets today. During the liberation era, African nations supported one another's struggles. Ghana, Tanzania, Algeria, Zambia, and others sacrificed resources because they believed African freedom was interconnected. That was solidarity. But economic hardship, unemployment, inequality, corruption, housing shortages, and unfulfilled expectations changed the landscape. When societies face pressure, frustration seeks a target. History shows that migrants and outsiders often become convenient scapegoats during times of uncertainty. South Africa occupies a unique place in this story. No nation benefited more from continental solidarity during the anti-apartheid struggle. This is why Afrophobic violence resonates so deeply across Africa. The issue is not only migration, it is memory, gratitude, identity, and the meaning of Pan-Africanism itself. This chapter is not about blaming South Africans or dismissing legitimate concerns about jobs, crime, or public services. The deeper question is, when tensions rise, why do fellow Africans become the focus of public anger? And perhaps the most important question of all, who benefits when Africans see other Africans as the enemy? To understand how solidarity became scapegoating, we must examine the forces that fuel modern tensions and the interests that profit from division. Before discussing solutions, we must define the problem. What is Afrophobia? At its core, Afrophobia is the fear, hostility, discrimination, or violence directed against fellow Africans within Africa itself. It is a form of xenophobia with a uniquely African contradiction. Africans who share similar histories, cultures, and struggles come to see one another as outsiders. This phenomenon strikes at the heart of the Pan-African ideal. South Africa provides the most visible example. More than 700 people have been killed in xenophobic attacks since 2008. Many perpetrators are themselves poor black South Africans, facing the economic legacy of apartheid. The tragedy is compounded by history. Countries such as Mozambique and Zimbabwe sheltered South African exiles during apartheid, yet some of their citizens now face violence in the very nation they once helped liberate. Afrophobia is not unique to South Africa. Across the continent, periods of economic hardship, political instability, and rising nationalism often turn migrants into convenient scapegoats. Tensions have surfaced in West Africa over trade and migration, in East Africa over citizenship and border security, and in Central Africa during times of political upheaval. An important distinction must be made. Debating immigration policy, border management, employment, or security is legitimate. Afrophobia begins when people are blamed simply because of where they come from, when stereotypes replace facts, and when frustration turns into discrimination or violence. At its deepest level, Afrophobia reveals a crisis of identity, belonging, and solidarity. If Africans begin to view fellow Africans as threats rather than partners, one of the central pillars of Pan-Africanism weakens. This brings us to the central question of this presentation. How did a liberation movement built on continental solidarity give way to suspicion and hostility between Africans? Was this inevitable, or the result of specific political, economic, and historical forces? If Afrophobia is the symptom, what is the underlying disease? To answer that, we must examine the conditions that transform hardship into hostility and neighbors into scapegoats. One of the biggest mistakes we can make is treating Afrophobia as a mystery. It is not. People are not born hating fellow Africans. If we want to understand Afrophobia, we must look beyond the violence and examine the conditions that allow it to grow. The roots run deep. In 1884, the Berlin Conference divided Africa into colonial territories without a single African present. In just 78 days, European powers drew borders that split communities, disrupted trade networks, and created many of the divisions that still shape the continent today. Economic hardship is one major factor. Across Africa, unemployment and poverty create frustration. When opportunities are scarce, migrants often become visible targets, blamed for problems they did not create. Identity fragmentation also plays a role. Colonial systems encouraged Africans to identify primarily by tribe, ethnicity, or colony, rather than as part of a wider African community. When Pan-African consciousness weakens, fellow Africans can be seen as foreigners rather than family. Politicians sometimes exploit these tensions. Instead of addressing corruption, poor governance, or economic failures, they redirect public anger toward migrants and outsiders. Media narratives can reinforce these divisions. Research by Media Monitoring Africa found that 73% of coverage of African migrants in South Africa was negative, often using language such as flood, invasion, and swarm. Such portrayals turn people into stereotypes, and stereotypes into targets. Finally, violence thrives when accountability is weak. When authorities fail to act, prosecute offenders, or protect vulnerable communities, impunity sends a dangerous message that some lives matter less than others. The deeper truth is that migrants are rarely the cause of society's problems. They become the visible target of frustrations rooted in economic hardship, colonial legacies, political opportunism, fear-based narratives, and weak institutions. This leads to the most important question of all. When Africans attack fellow Africans, are they confronting the true source of their suffering, or merely the nearest symbol of it? Because if we misdiagnose the problem, we will never solve it. And if these are the roots of Afrophobia, another question naturally follows. Who benefits when Africans are divided? Who gains when Africans are encouraged to see one another as competitors instead of partners? This slide may be the most uncomfortable in the entire presentation, because it forces us to compare what Africa once aspired to be with what we often see today. On the left is the spirit that helped liberate the continent. On the right is the reality many Africans now confront. The gap between those two worlds is what I call the great contradiction. Consider Zambia. When Kenneth Kaunda closed the Zambia-Rhodesia border in solidarity with liberation movements, it cost Zambia nearly 15% of its GDP and plunged the country into economic crisis. He did it anyway. That was solidarity. Today, intra-African trade stands at roughly 15%, meaning African nations often trade more with Europe and China than with each other. The economic architecture of colonialism remains remarkably intact. Nkrumah declared that Ghana's independence was meaningless unless all of Africa was free. Nyerere opened Tanzania to liberation movements. Mozambique sheltered ANC fighters. Algeria trained freedom fighters from across the continent. These leaders did not ask, "What country are you from?" They asked, "What cause are you fighting for?" Their identity was African. Their struggle was collective. Today we sometimes see African businesses attacked by fellow Africans, migrants scapegoated, and cooperation replaced by suspicion. The same continent that mobilized to free South Africa now debates whether fellow Africans belong. What changed? Economic pressures intensified, political incentives shifted, national identities strengthened, and Pan-African consciousness weakened. The dream did not disappear overnight, it faded from public consciousness. The tragic irony is that many migrants today cross borders for the same reasons liberation fighters once did: safety, opportunity, and a better future. So we arrive at the central question. If earlier generations sacrificed for Africans they had never met, why are some Africans unwilling to stand with Africans they see every day? This is not primarily a question about migration. It is a question about identity. Who are we? A collection of isolated nations, or a continent with a shared destiny? Numbers do not tell the whole story, but they often reveal patterns that are difficult to ignore. Consider 6 numbers. 700 plus deaths. Since 2008, xenophobic and Afrophobic violence in South Africa has claimed hundreds of lives. Behind every statistic is a human being, a parent, worker, student, entrepreneur, or family member. These tragedies force us to ask, how did a nation whose liberation was supported by Africans across the continent arrive here? 54 borders. Africa's modern borders largely emerged from the colonial era. While borders are necessary for modern states, they also shape who is considered a citizen and who is treated as a foreigner. 65%. Critics of the CFA franc system argue that key financial decisions affecting parts of Africa remain tied to institutions outside the continent. The debate ultimately raises a larger question: how much control should Africans have over their own economic future? 15%. Only about 15% of Africa's trade is with other African countries, far below levels seen in Europe and other regions. The result is missed opportunities, weaker integration, and continued dependence on external markets. 200 plus coups. Since independence, Africa has experienced more than 200 coups and attempted coups. Political instability has often weakened institutions and interrupted long-term development. $18 billion. African countries collectively spend enormous sums servicing external debt each year. For many Pan-African thinkers, this reflects an ongoing struggle between political independence and economic dependency. Taken together, these numbers tell a story of fragmentation and unfinished liberation. But the most important number is missing: the cost of division itself. The businesses never built, the partnerships never formed, the innovations never shared, the prosperity never created. Every time Africans are encouraged to see fellow Africans as enemies, the continent pays a price. And that leads us to the next question. If division is so costly, who benefits from it? Who gains when Africa remains fragmented rather than united? The deeper we investigate Afrophobia, the more we are forced to ask not only why it happens, but who benefits when it happens. Let us now follow the incentives, the power, and the interests behind division. We now arrive at perhaps the most controversial question in this presentation: who benefits? Or, as the Romans asked, cui bono? Whenever a society becomes deeply divided, whenever ordinary people fight one another rather than examining larger systems, it is worth asking, who gains? This is not to suggest that Africa's problems are caused solely by outsiders, nor that Africans bear no responsibility. Reality is more complex, but history teaches us that division often benefits certain interests, while unity threatens them. Consider arms exports. SIPRI data shows Africa receives roughly $5 to $7 billion in arms annually. Conflict creates demand, and instability creates markets. Consider resource extraction. The DRC alone possesses an estimated $24 trillion in mineral wealth, yet has experienced decades of conflict. A united Africa negotiating collectively would possess far greater bargaining power than 54 separate states negotiating individually. Consider finance. The global economic system largely deals with African nations one at a time. Nkrumah's vision of a continental central bank, treasury, and common market sought to reduce this dependency. But not all beneficiaries of division are external. Politicians can exploit nationalist sentiment to divert attention from unemployment, corruption, and inequality. Migrants become convenient scapegoats, while governance failures escape scrutiny. The lesson is not to create new enemies. It is to think critically. Whenever people are encouraged to fight one another, ask, who gains politically? Who gains economically? Who avoids scrutiny? Who profits from the distraction? The greatest beneficiary of African division is often not a country, corporation, or institution. It is division itself. A divided Africa negotiates from weakness, trades less, cooperates less, and struggles to transform its vast potential into collective power. That is why Pan-Africanists placed unity at the center of their vision. The dream is wounded, but it is not dead. The question is whether this generation will reclaim it. Throughout this presentation, we have explored history, politics, economics, and institutions. But statistics and theories can only take us so far. Afrophobia is not experienced by governments. It is experienced by people, workers, students, traders, parents, and dreamers trying to build a better life. The first voice is a Senegalese trader in Johannesburg. His father fought for liberation, believing in a united Africa. Yet decades later, his grandson is called a foreigner and watches his livelihood destroyed. His question, for what, is not just about a burned shop. It is about whether the sacrifices of previous generations still matter. The second voice is a South African construction worker. He is not speaking from hatred, but desperation. No jobs, hungry children, broken promises. His powerful admission, "Someone gave me someone to blame," captures a painful truth. When people suffer, they seek explanations, and the easiest explanation is not always the correct one. The final voice is an educator, reflecting on Nkrumah's dream. She warns, "They have convinced our children we are enemies." Her point is profound. The problem is not only economic, it is psychological, educational, and cultural. A generation raised on liberation has been followed by one increasingly taught competition and division. Together, these voices reveal the same reality. The migrant feels betrayed, the worker abandoned, and the elder fears something precious has been forgotten. When systems fail, people often blame one another instead of confronting deeper causes. This is why discussions about Afrophobia must remain human. Every attack creates trauma, every act of exclusion breeds resentment, and every division pushes African unity further away. As you listen to these voices, ask yourself, what would happen if these people saw one another not as competitors, but as allies facing the same struggles? Because if the Pan-African dream is to be rebuilt, it will not begin in government buildings. It will begin when ordinary Africans once again recognize themselves in one another. We have explored the dream, the betrayal, and the divisions of the present. Now we turn to a more important question. What will it take to reclaim the dream? Every meaningful journey ends with a choice, and that is where we are now. We have explored the rise of Pan-Africanism, the victories of liberation, the forces that fragmented the dream, and the painful realities of Afrophobia and division. But this story does not end in despair. The dream is not dead. It is wounded. It is unfinished. But it is still alive. We did not come here to mourn Pan-Africanism. We came to understand why it was interrupted, and how it can be revived. In fact, some of the very tools Nkrumah envisioned are beginning to emerge. The generation of Nkrumah, Nyerere, Lumumba, Cabral, and Sankara fought for political freedom. Our generation faces a different challenge: integration. The question is no longer, can Africa become independent? The question is, can Africa become united enough to thrive? Projects like AFCFTA seek to make it easier for Africans to trade with Africans, create jobs, strengthen value chains, and reduce dependence on external markets. The African Union, despite its limitations, reflects the growing recognition that Africa's future cannot be built through isolation. And unity matters now more than ever. In an age of AI, climate change, digital economies, and geopolitical competition, no African nation can fully navigate the future alone. Together, Africa represents 1.5 billion people, the world's youngest population, vast resources, and extraordinary potential. But economics alone will not save the dream. Institutions alone will not save the dream. The dream must first be reclaimed in the mind. An African from Dakar, Nairobi, Johannesburg, Accra, Lagos, Kigali, Cairo, or Kinshasa is not a stranger. We are part of the same historical journey, the same unfinished story, and the same future. The founders of Pan-Africanism gave us a vision. The liberation generation gave us freedom. The question now is, what will our generation contribute? The dream was born in chains. It survived colonialism, assassination, coups, and fragmentation. The question is no longer whether the dream can survive. The question is whether we are willing to carry it forward. If the previous chapters examined what Africa lost, this slide examines what Africa could still become. Despite fragmentation, division, and the rise of Afrophobia, one development suggests the Pan-African dream is not finished. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA. AFCFTA is real. It is operational. 54 countries have signed it. In many ways, it is Nkrumah's common market finally taking shape 60 years later. Yet the gap between vision and reality remains vast. Less than 15% of African trade is conducted within Africa itself, compared to much higher levels in Europe and Asia. The target is 30% by 2030, but achieving that requires more than agreements. Roads, railways, payment systems, logistics, and trust must be built. The software exists. Much of the hardware is still catching up. The scale is extraordinary. 1.4 billion people, and a combined GDP exceeding $3 trillion, making AFCFTA the world's largest free trade area by membership. It is proof that the dream of African unity never completely disappeared. AFCFTA seeks to transform borders from barriers into bridges by reducing tariffs, simplifying regulations, and making it easier for Africans to trade, invest, and build together. This matters not only economically, but socially. People who trade together are less likely to fear one another. Economic integration creates relationships, shared interests, jobs, and opportunities. It turns potential rivals into partners. Ultimately, AFCFTA is more than a trade agreement. It is a test of whether Africans can trust one another enough to build together. The greatest obstacle is not geography, it is mindset. This is a choice between fragmentation and integration, suspicion and cooperation. And that is why many see AFCFTA as the strongest evidence that the dream of African unity is still alive. The African Union AU, launched in 2002 to replace the OAU, represents Africa's most ambitious attempt to turn the Pan-African dream into practical integration. Its achievements include creating African-led security institutions, advancing Agenda 2063 as a long-term development blueprint, promoting free movement across the continent, and pursuing peace through initiatives like silencing the guns. These efforts reflect a vision of Africans solving African problems together. Yet major challenges remain. The AU still relies heavily on external funding, struggles with democratic legitimacy among ordinary Africans, has limited enforcement power, and continues to face the resurgence of military coups. These realities expose the gap between continental aspirations and political realities. Despite its flaws, the AU remains Africa's closest experiment in continental governance. The question is not whether it is perfect, but whether Africans can strengthen, democratize, and support it. If AFCFTA is the economic engine of integration, the AU is the political vehicle. The future of African unity depends not only on institutions, but on how Africans choose to see and support one another. One of the greatest ironies of Pan-Africanism is that the movement that inspired Africa's liberation did not begin in Africa. It began largely in the diaspora. Before many Africans imagined independence, thinkers such as Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, George Padmore, and C.L.R. James were already envisioning African unity. In many ways, the diaspora helped dream Africa into freedom. That is why the African Union recognizes the diaspora as Africa's sixth region, not outsiders, but part of Africa itself. Today, more than 200 million people of African descent live beyond the continent, while Africans abroad send over $100 billion home each year, more than double the foreign aid Africa receives. The diaspora is not just a historical legacy. It is an economic, intellectual, cultural, and political force. The challenge now is to transform remittances into investment, talent into transformation, and global networks into continental progress. Pan-Africanism was born in the diaspora, helped liberate the continent, and may help revive its future. The dream is bigger than borders, passports, or governments. It is the belief that Africans everywhere share a connected destiny, and that together, they can help build the Africa they want to see. Thomas Sankara represents one of Africa's greatest unfinished possibilities. Not because he was perfect, but because he dared to ask, what if Africa truly believed in itself? Between 1983 and 1987, Sankara transformed Burkina Faso through food self-sufficiency, anti-corruption reforms, women's empowerment, environmental protection, and Pan-African solidarity. He proved that bold, ethical, independent governance was possible. His most famous challenge came in 1987, when he called on African nations to collectively reject unjust debt, warning that debt had become a new form of control. If we do repay, we will die. 6 months later, he was assassinated. What made Sankara dangerous was not his speeches or popularity. It was the fact that he demonstrated another path was possible. He showed that Africa could rely on its own people, resources, and ideas. His lessons remain relevant today: self-reliance, integrity, courage, innovation, environmental stewardship, women's liberation, and continental unity. Sankara's question still confronts us. Will Africa continue managing inherited problems, or will it invent a new future? The dream was born in chains. It survived colonialism, betrayal, and division. Through a generation willing to imagine what others cannot see, it can still be fulfilled. Every presentation arrives at the same question. We understand the problem, we know the history, we see the consequences, but what must be done? Pan-Africanism survives only when translated into action. First, decolonize education. Young Africans cannot build continental consciousness if they know more about European history than Nkrumah, Sankara, Cabral, Nzinga, or the Mandan Charter. You cannot love what you do not know. Second, Build Pan-African media that helps Africans understand one another beyond stereotypes and borders. Third, make free movement a reality. Cooperation grows when Africans can travel, work, and build across the continent. Fourth, strengthen economic sovereignty. Political independence without economic power remains incomplete. Fifth, democratize continental institutions so citizens, not just elites, shape Africa's future. Sixth, pursue collective global advocacy. 54 voices matter. One coordinated voice is transformative. Finally, invest in youth leadership. Africa's future belongs to its 700 million young people. The next Sankara, Wangari Maathai, Nkrumah, or Lumumba may be watching this right now. The dream was born in the diaspora, carried by freedom fighters, tested by division, and sustained by hope. The question is not whether we inherited the dream. The question is what we will do with it. We have reached the end of this presentation, but this is where the real work begins. Pan-Africanism is not a slogan, a conference, or a hashtag. It is a daily practice, a way of thinking, living, and making choices. Every time an African travels within Africa, supports an African business, or builds relationships across borders, they are practicing Pan-Africanism. The future of African unity will not be decided only in presidential palaces or AU summits. It will be decided by ordinary Africans, every day. First, learn. Read Nkrumah, Walter Rodney, Cheikh Anta Diop, Thomas Sankara, and other African thinkers. Knowledge is the foundation of solidarity. When we do not know our shared history, we become vulnerable to division. Second, connect. Build friendships, join study groups, attend cultural events, follow African news, and engage with Africans across the continent and the diaspora. Every meaningful connection weakens stereotypes and builds bridges. Third, build. Support African businesses, creators, media, schools, and innovators. Unity without economic cooperation is fragile. Shared prosperity strengthens shared identity. Challenge division wherever you find it. When you hear Afrophobic language, misinformation, or stereotypes, respond with facts, empathy, and confidence. Every prejudice survives because good people remain silent. The deepest battle for Africa's future is not political or economic. It is about identity. Will we choose suspicion or solidarity, fear or cooperation, fragmentation or partnership? The dream survived slavery, colonialism, coups, and division. It survives today in every African who believes our shared future is greater than our differences. Africa's unity begins with us, one conversation, one connection, one act of solidarity at a time. If this presentation challenged your thinking, share it. The most powerful Pan-African tool available today may be a YouTube algorithm and 30 free minutes. Share this video. This is how Africans teach, connect, and build with one another. We began this journey asking, what happened to Pan-Africanism? We explored liberation and betrayal, unity and division, Pan-Africanism and Afrophobia. But Africa's story is not one of failure. It is a story of interruption. Pan-Africanism did not die with Nkrumah. It did not die with Lumumba, Sankara, or the struggles that followed. It is wounded, tested, and delayed, but it lives. It lives in every African student discovering their history. It lives in every AFCFTA shipment crossing a border. It lives in every diaspora remittance, building homes, businesses, and futures across the continent. It lives in every African who chooses solidarity over division. Nkrumah said, "I am not African because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was born in me." The dream survived slavery, colonialism, coups, debt, and division, because generations refused to let it die. Now it is in our hands. The question is not whether Africa will unite. The question is when. And that depends on us. Africa's destiny has always been greater than her borders. Before you go, help this message reach more people. If you learned something new today, like the video, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who still thinks Africa is a country. Small conversations can challenge big misconceptions, and every share helps expand understanding. If you want to explore this topic further, scan the QR code for additional resources, courses, recommended readings, maps, and extended discussions. There is far more to Africa than what can fit into a single episode, and this is only the beginning of a much deeper journey into the continent's history, cultures, people, and future. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any topic related to Africa or Pan-Africanism, leave a comment below and we'll cover it in a future video.